Welcome, everybody, to a special edition of Sensus Fidelium. I didn't even know what the name was for a minute. My brain just went off. Father R., there's something that happened today. Welcome to the program. Thanks for jumping in. If you've been under a rock, maybe like me, I might not have seen it if I didn't log on to Twitter to see all the thousands of texts and tweets. But yeah, something out of the ordinary happened. So we came on for today.
Yeah, obviously the removal of Bishop Strickland from his diocese was the big news. My phone, of course, blew up as soon as that happened.
Your battery died after 30 minutes of being up. I hear you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it was just one thing after another. People say, "Did you see this? Did you see this?" Yeah, of course. I got it really early. Very early, because I got it from a Roman correspondent who sent it to me. And then I just sent it out, and I got it very early in the morning. So I just sent it out to everybody, letting everybody know.
Yeah, I've had priests write me and say, my phone's blowing up. What's going on? First off, please do not contact me. Contact him over there. He knows more than I do. And everyone else knows more than I do. So anyways, Father, so we wanted to talk about magisterial authority. And yeah. you have a book on the website on centradpress.com, which is up on the screen if you guys aren't seeing us here. The magisterial authority, you've had it for years.
Yes.
You always say in a lot of us lectures you give, if you just get this book, a lot of the problems you see, you'll be more peace, more calm in a sense. How do we explain like today with that?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things. I just did a conference this afternoon for a men's Legatus group, and the Q&A, the first question was, what do you think about the Pope removing Bishop Strickland, which of course was the first question that they asked. And I made two observations because I was talking publicly. I didn't want to get too much into it, but I'm willing to kind of mention it here, I think. The first is that, the Pope does have the authority to remove a bishop. I mean, it shouldn't be capricious like that on a moral level or a prudential level, but he does actually have that authority because he has immediate and supreme jurisdiction over the whole of the church, right? I'm sure there's going to be canonists come out who say, oh, no, he can't do that. He's not supposed to be doing that. But, he obviously does have that authority. That's a different question from whether he should do it. And I think prudentially that he did not have, normally you don't remove somebody from an office without a penal cause. That is, there should be some grave cause. And I think the biggest frustration that we're seeing with people is that, there's all these bishops who are doing all this bad stuff and they're getting away with it and they're not being removed. But, you have someone like Bishop Strickland who's just trying to be a faithful son to the church and to the teachings of Christ and the tradition, and he's just getting sacked, so to speak. So I think there's that element. But the other side of it, I just said, so that's the first part. The second part is that we get the leaders we deserve. I mean, this is the one thing that people just don't seem to get in regard to the stuff that is that's going on in the church and all the people that have kind of gained ascendancy in the church, is that this is a sign that as Catholics, we're not being as faithful as we need to be. We need to really start being holy to stop this, so that God will actually give us the leaders that we deserve, which would be good leaders. But then I think the other thing is too, and I think this is something that we're beginning to see, and I don't think I'm speaking out of line here. I'm not judging the Holy Father. I'm not judging anybody who works at the Vatican. In fact, I don't even know them as individuals, but the impression that is being left is that this is just malicious, right? That they're persecuting Catholics who are faithful, and it seems to be on purpose. It doesn't seem to be the type of thing that they're, because they're leaving the bad guys in place and going after the good guys. That seems to be the general thing. So even though the Pope does have that, I think that this removal of the bishop is actually going to be a loss of political clout quite a bit on the side of the Vatican. So, but we'll see. We'll see what comes of it. So anyway, the point being is that, yeah, he does have that authority in the immediate and supreme jurisdiction. The problem is, though, you shouldn't remove somebody, especially when it comes to the episcopate or even the priesthood, without a grave cause.
Kind of like in the other, I was about to segue into the book that you published before, because I think Michael Davies even mentioned it decades ago, and you probably did in the book too, about just like even the Mass, he has the authority, but might not be very prudent to do so.
Yeah. So, well, let me just back up just a little bit. You know, there's different levels of stuff that we're actually dealing with. So, the first level is doctrinal authority that the actual Pope has. And so, if you actually look at, you know, I did a trilogy. I'm actually thinking of doing a fourth part to this. So, the first one, of course, is the binding force of tradition. This is the one that starts laying it out that even the Holy Father is bound by the tradition of the church. It's not, and it's not a case of a preferential option for the tradition, right? To use a phrase. It is, no, we are morally bound because the tradition is the means of transmission of the truth that will save us, and also the means of salvation, such as baptism and the sacraments and things like that. So we're actually morally and spiritually, but we're morally bound to follow the tradition. So, and that applies even to the Pope. Then the question becomes, well, how does it apply to the Pope? And so I started talking about that in that book. And I also point out in that book something that's really key is that, because everybody says, well, the magisterium is the rule of faith. Well, it is, but it's the proximate rule of faith. And the remote rule of faith is the tradition. It's what has been passed on to us. So the Pope and the bishops become a rule of faith precisely because they pass on the remote rule of faith to us intact with the proper interpretations, etc. And it's if they vary from that. So, for example, if tomorrow the Pope were to come out and say that it was okay to commit fornication, well, we know from the constant teaching of the church, from the tradition, from Scripture, and the church's teaching all along that is simply not the case. And so we know that he's at variance with the remote rule, and so we always default to the remote rule, that is, to the tradition. The tradition takes precedence in relationship to the Pope. Now, he can interpret parts of the tradition and that type of thing, but his interpretation still has to be in line with the tradition. So that's the primary thing that I deal with, the binding force of tradition. I also deal with when he's infallible, when he's not. In magisterial authority, I also deal with infallibility, but I also deal with, well, what about if he's speaking at times when he's not speaking infallible? If there's times when he's not speaking, so when he's not speaking infallibly, what is the theological weight? So that book starts getting into the entire discussion prior to the council, actually for several hundred years, about different statements have different degrees of theological certitude. And so as a result of that, it's a good indicator for us to recognize that that there are times when outside, when the Pope is infallible, he can actually commit error, which we've started to see in more recently, I think. But also that, so for example, if he's sitting on an airplane doing an interview, there's no guarantee because he doesn't meet the criteria for infallibility, and so he can actually end up in error. St. Thomas even says that there's only one time that we have certitude that the Pope actually has right ordered faith about a particular doctrine is when he speaks infallibly. So, I mean, generally we can tell just by the way they carry themselves, but magisterial authority deals with the different degrees of theological weight about the statements that are actually made. And that's a key thing. And then, of course, the consensus of the theologian provides yet another source by which we know. Okay, so that's on the doctrinal level. Then there is on the disciplinary level. Canon law is not infallible necessarily. It can contain stuff that's infallible, but then also in the disciplinary level, it's generally conceded, at least from the stuff I read, although Ryan, who looks like you think he just joined us, might be able to weigh in a little bit more on this on some of his reading, but it seems to indicate that when it comes to the infallibility, when the Pope is promulgating a right, it's not possible for the Pope to promulgate an invalid right. That's kind of the general. So this is one of course, the state of conscience today would deny that, but that's kind of the general consensus that was actually out there, that when promulgating a right, but when it comes to the rest of the liturgy, there's no guarantee that he's going to do everything correctly. This is one of the reasons why historically the popes were very slow to make any changes. Well, recently there were statements that were being made, and I don't mean to hog the camera here so much, but recently there were made some statements by Cardinal Burke and by Archbishop Athanasius Schneider, or sorry, Bishop Athanasius Schneider, when he said that, the Pope doesn't have the authority to suppress the old rite, doesn't have the authority to restrict it or what have you. And I would agree with them, but the difficulty was, I kept thinking to myself, what are the principles that undergird that? And I didn't see anybody really talking about those principles that determine that. I mean, some were talking about certain things, like Kwasniewski's been talking about, well, the Pope, our obedience to the Pope is based on certain things. And then you had other people say, well, it has to be for the good of the church and all that. I agree with that, but there has to be more foundational principles. And so what I did is I went back and I looked at the fathers of the church, I looked at the theologians and the medieval period. I actually looked at the councils and what the popes themselves and the church documents say about what the Pope can and cannot do regarding liturgical change. And so that's when I decided, well, I'm going to write a book. And that's what this book is. It's called The Limits of Papal Authority over the Liturgy. And it was not available until tonight for the general public. It was only available to theologians and to certain priests who would read it. And it was primarily put out to float it to them first to see if they found anything that was problematic, but also to make sure that the discussion of the principles started circulating among the priests and the intelligentsia first before it kind of got out to the general public. But now I'm promoting this book principally because I think as we go forward, if they're willing to move a bishop without a penal cause, then we can see that they might, and there's an indicator they're going to keep restricting the old rite and things like that. And so I just wanted to make sure that those principles were laid out. That's a different thing than from the prudential activities of the church. There's no guarantee that the Pope is not impeccable. That is, he can commit sin, and so it is possible, or even he can be mistaken in his prudential judgments about what should or should not be done. So when you're talking about the exercise of his jurisdiction and the removal of a bishop, he may or may not be acting prudently, objectively speaking. Subjectively, who knows where he's at, but objectively, it may or may not be the case. So the reason I think that the books that I've written are important is because it starts to give people a perspective on the precise nature of how the church herself understands the limits of papal authority in a variety of different areas.
And the mass book is in the comments section if anybody's watching at home, and posted on social media. It's at centrad.org. You showed it on the thing. Ryan, you translated a few books by some guy named Bellarmine who wrote this huge treatise on the papacy. So maybe what would he say about pretty much piggyback on what Father said about the authority of the papacy?
Well, what he gets into is the principle that St. Robert Bellarmine's getting into is the question of the Protestants say X about the Pope. And so he proceeds in the treatise to start with defense of the existence of the papacy as an office, that it is found in Scripture. This is not a made-up medieval doctrine. This is what's taught by the fathers. This is what the Scripture itself shows, and argues, again, monarchy is the best form of government. The papal government is monarchy. As God gave this form to the church, etc. And after he proceeds through there, he goes to the successors of Peter. And it's not until the fourth book, I mean, a little bit in the second as well, and showing the authority of the Pope in terms of his jurisdiction over the church. And that's in the second book largely. The third book is on Antichrist. I also have that excerpted in case anyone's looking for that. But then the fourth one is on then the Pope's authority and faith and morals and whatnot. And so at that time, they were still working on like getting the precise terms. So Bellarmine actually doesn't offer you nearly as much as, say, Suarez does, or it is Treatise de Summo Pontifice, which is in, I forget which volume of Suarez's Opera Omnia that's in, I think 10, but I could have that wrong. But anyway, because so for Bellarmine's dealing with just simply proving that when the Pope teaches on articles of faith in such a way that the whole church has to believe it, and that he would otherwise be binding people to believe error, that he couldn't possibly err in that respect. And again, he deals with the question, and then on morals too, right? And so that's where the joining these two concepts of faith and morals, that the church cannot force somebody to engage in moral behavior that is actually immoral, right? And so he goes through that question too, and then then he carries on. Answering Protestants who argued that this Pope erred and this Pope erred, etc. So, And then the fifth book's just simply on the temporal jurisdiction in terms of the Pope's like civil authority, right? Which isn't really a big thing except of historical interest today. So going back in the second and fourth books, that's where, it's clear that, the Pope has jurisdiction, and that again, the Pope has, because he is Christ's victor, he is the visible head of the church. And so not the head, the invisible head, which is Christ, but he's the visible head, right? And so that he's acting for Christ on earth and all those things that pertain to the earthly church. And that's essentially how Bellarmine lays it out. So there, and then that's really, again, he's trying to respond to the Protestants. So he's not trying to get into the nitty gritty of every last thing. He does take up that question of what happens if a pope would become a heretic, if a pope would teach error, and he gives the various opinions on it. That's a question I don't really want to delve into very much anymore because it's become so contentious. And if you want to hear the fuller treatment on that, I did an interview with Taylor Marshall several years ago that went over that. So if anyone wants more on that question, it's probably best to lay it out there, because we devoted, I think, about an hour and a half of show to that particular question. So at least as far as Bellarmine goes.
You've talked ad nauseum about that before. I remember you saying you wrote this much of a book and they only want to talk about that much.
Well, that's the thing too. So Bellarmine writes this 700 pages on the papacy, and people buy it because they want those 4 pages that deal with this particular question. So it is a bit galling. At least they're buying the book. So I mean, there's that much.
Get the short version.
Well, maybe at some point, Ryan, they'll read the rest of it.
Yeah, at some point.
There's 900 good pages with that. Yes.
Yeah, and then there's some subsequent volumes too in terms of councils and the authority of councils and other things. And he makes some commentary on it there too, which again I think I addressed that also in that same episode I mentioned.
Yeah, you did one with Brother Andre back in the day on the councils, and well, shoot, you did them all. You did touch on pretty much every translation you have on it somewhere.
That was a few years ago. Better times than 2023.
Yes. Father, how does this is all tie into the principle of operation? You sent me that link. I have it done. I'll be posting that later, but is all what you were saying before all tied into that?
Yeah, it does. I mean, at least indirectly, in the sense that, so basically the principle of operation, I'll just be very brief because people can listen to the longer conference. But basically, the principle of operation states that the nature of the thing, to put it, the Latin phrase is agere sequitur esse. So the nature of the thing determines how it behaves, right? Action follows upon being. And so what I was basically talking about, it has both a ontological and a gnosiological meaning. The ontological means is that the nature of the thing determines how it's going to behave, right? And this is Christ himself said it, a good tree cannot produce bad fruit. So it's going to certain types of causes are going to produce certain kinds of effects. Gnosiologically, or that is what we can know epistemologically, you can also though look at the effects and then reason yourself back to the cause. And so what's happening in the church today, I was just kind of pointing out, just by way of a general observation, that we see that things are bad in the church, really bad in the church. But when you start talking about, well, this is where the causes come from. Well, no, you're not permitted to do that. You're not permitted to say that it could be something in, that say that the lack of doctrinal clarity in the second documents of the second, or certain documents of the Second Vatican Council. You're not permitted to say that it goes actually back to problems in the liturgy, or you're not permitted to do that. There was I can't remember where it was. Maybe it was on Rorate Caeli, but it was on one of those where one of the authors was basically saying there's like these super dogmas. The super dogma is you can't criticize this, you can't criticize, when these dogmas are not even infallible, right? So the point being, I was just basically pointing out in that is that when we see bad things happen, we do need to trace it back. Well, what's the root cause? And I do think that, like the removal of Bishop Strickland is something bad, because there's, at least on a public level, there has not been any demonstration that he had done any kind of grave evil. And that being the case, then to remove him is an injustice of a sort. But anyway, so that being the case, I think that, the real question is do we trace it back to the root cause? And I think there's all sorts of root causes in this regard. But that being said, so it is kind of connected to that, in the sense that this is one of the few times I've really started talking more openly about, we're seeing problems in the church. This is what we're actually seeing. And as a result of that, we need to start taking a look back at what's the source of what's the nature of the cause? Because until we do that, and I do that a little bit in the book, The Limits of Papal Authority Over the Liturgy, there is one point where I just basically say, well, look, if we're seeing certain things in the liturgy, there has to be an authentic airing out of the issue. We have to look at it, be honest with ourselves in the church, look at it and say, what is the actual problem? Put aside all the nonsense or the emotional attachments and baggage that people have in wanting to think that a pope has to be perfect and things of that sort. We have to put all that aside and say, what's the root cause? What's the nature of it? And so that we can actually deal with it. And so, but anyway, so that's in the principle of operation. I kind of go into those kinds of things where it's simply a discussion of we're seeing bad effects, and this is what we just saw today. What's the root cause? And so I think we have to trace it back. And this is one of the reasons I mentioned that, the real part of one of the root causes is that we don't get the leaders we deserve. But there it is.
Yeah, that's one thing no one likes hearing, especially in our community circles, the ownership of ourselves or change the man in the mirror type deal. Ryan, being our resident historian, which you're the only one in my residential area, we could trade. I mean, St. Bruno had the pornocracy ran by prostitutes. The church was ran by prostitutes. You had Alphonsus unjustly taken away from the leadership of the Redemptorists. Saint Teresa, Saint John of the Cross, both was unjustly done. Saint Pio, modern times you can say Sheen. There was a nun that got excommunicated by a bishop, and she made sure that no one would trash him afterwards. I mean, is it kind of like? I mean, everything's different. I hate that, like in sports, when they say that's the greatest of our generation, or the greatest in the sport history. You can't compare the two. So how do you? I guess try not to compare now to back then, to let people know that, hey, we've been through some really weird times before. I think of like the Conniver Synod. Imagine that being with 24/7 social media and Fox News. Just some ideas like that from historical context of bad things, bad popes.
Yeah, and you don't have to full screen me just in case Father wants to jump in. And plus, I'm not absolutely certain of my connection. That seems to mess with it. But anyway, you got to be very careful. Like if you're going to draw a historical parallel, that it has to be precisely honest to all the constituent elements of the authority in question that caused the issue or misused its authority or whatever. The circumstances under which that particular saint was unjustly persecuted or what have you. So, I mean, if you look at like St. Alphonsus, that was actually the Spanish crown in Naples that had forced him away from his order. And it was a particular law that was passed in the Kingdom of Naples that brought that about. And then church authority is, of course, moving in line with the government. But it was ultimately a question of the government. And then, and he had to suffer that, through. So that wouldn't be an example we'd want to draw to go toward. The Arian crisis, I think, generally is altogether like it. So you'll have a lot of people comparing to that. Maybe we're almost there. We may very well be turning a corner on that one, but you'll get people like that want to argue for the Western Schism, where that actually doesn't work as a good parallel either, because the general nature of the church, as far as going down to the level of the pew, the average man, was functioning rather normally. And wherever you had one of the two and then three popes, once the Pisan Council fell apart and they elected Baldassare Costa as John the 25th, the anti-pope John the 23rd. They had, every area that they ruled, well, the monarchs enforced their laws ecclesiastically. And then when that was all solved, all of those, any laws they published got ratified after the Council of Constance by Pope Martin V. So that one doesn't really give a lot of good examples. People love to run to it. Sedevacantists love to run to the Western Schism, but it just doesn't actually, supply a whole lot of good examples. You have Saint Norbert deprived of his bishopric because of the local politics and against the will of the church. You have all kinds of things like that. You don't have anything quite. You have popes that remove bishops when they became a public and notorious problem. But even to say under like Alexander VI, he filled up every open appointment he could with his family members who were living in Rome. That's for sure. He managed to chase away several cardinals that are his enemies in exile. But I could have missed it. It could be there. I haven't gone over with a fine tooth and comb all of his ecclesiastical acts, but I've not read that bishops who were critical of him got sacked. In fact, he usually didn't care, as he's too busy at parties and things like that, rather than giving airplane pressers and such. Or in those days, boat pressers. So it's so you just got the biggest thing in a historical parallel is you have to look for the occasion and who is the authority in question. Was it used justly or unjustly? And then the subject, did it? What were the circumstances where they were removed? And then we can kind of draw that parallel back to, say, Bishop Strickland. And so there's not a whole ton of it, to be perfectly honest. Prior to Vatican II, the ecclesiology generally held, and I think, and Bellarmine actually lays it out in the aforementioned book on the Roman Pontiff, that he had, the Pope had, once he gives that jurisdiction, the bishop possesses it in right, in his person, in his own right. He possesses that, and so he is properly and duly the bishop at that point. He does not possess it in such a way as the owner of it, where he could then give that jurisdiction to somebody else, unless that too had been conceded by the Supreme Pontiff. Say, for example, the patriarchs of the Eastern churches in antiquity, or in the reconstituted Eastern churches in the 18th century. Those patriarchs had the power to establish bishops and whatnot, and give them jurisdiction, because that was so conceded to that patriarch, right? And so that was kind of the understanding of it. So Vatican II does something interesting, and I don't know how the tradition will ultimately judge this, but they say that the bishop, once he becomes that bishop, like hand in glove, Lumen Gentium seems to indicate he is now the bishop in his own right, purely by the fact that he is the bishop. So even though in principle the Pope can, has supreme jurisdiction of the church, and he can change whatever canons he feels that he needs to, or set them aside because of a given case, it would seem to be really strongly against Vatican II for the Pope to just come in and summarily fire a bishop, as the current Holy Father has done with like 4 or 5, if I'm not mistaken. All for, very dubious things, almost all of them because they were too conservative, or had supported tradition, or or like the kind of thing like you get in a parish with a whole bunch of boomers, and that complete, they want the 70s, and that's all they want. And if you're a young couple who comes in and say, "Oh, Father, wouldn't you consider a mass without music?" Or "Wouldn't you consider, bringing in these types of things?" And he does. And then that boomer will go complain to the bishop, and he's yanked out of there and sent somewhere else. Or the priest came and dared to say, "We're going to get rid of this, the glop, the glory and praise hymnal, as it were, which will be on repeat in hell in the lower church. And we're going to throw this out, and I'm going to bring in a far more conservative hymnal, or a St. Gregory's hymnal, or whatever, and we're going to do more traditional conservative hymns that are better for piety and for the faithful." And then you get someone to complain, he's going to be thrown out of there. Well, it's exactly the same way in Rome at the moment, where I'm sure the Holy Father probably would never have even concerned himself or known or cared much about Strickland, except he's got a whole cadre of guys around him who are of the same mindset as the German bishops, and of the same mindset as a Supich, or other people that
there's a litany of them
of infelicitous mention that I could bring up. And so and they're like, "Oh, this guy's a problem," and then the Pope said, "All right, get rid of him." And that's a lot of what, not to say that he himself may not come from that same view, but it's like, if you're going to get rid of a bishop, and Father, you can correct me, it seems to me that both the faithful of his diocese, and to the extent that he is a more high profile and better known bishop, the faithful in the wider region that he resides in, should be made aware of what specifically he did that constituted such a crime that he had to be removed. And if that's so, is that being applied across the board? It's
well, yeah, I think that you kind of touched on it. The general kind of approach, especially in recent times, I don't know if it was so much in the past. I just haven't studied the question as closely, like, say, during the period of the theologians and things of that sort. That is from 1100 to 1750. I never have really looked at it that closely. But I mean, there is some kind of indicator in it. But the fact that, once a bishop is installed, it's generally understood that he had certain rights just by virtue of being installed. The difficulty obviously becomes because of the prime's immediate and supreme jurisdiction. It means he can supersede or overrule those rights. But it's like anything else. Okay, you might have authority over it, but for the sake of the common good, generally speaking, you have to observe the rights that people have, because otherwise, if you don't, you're going to end up with bigger problems on your hands, because now these injustices are going to occur. The second thing is, if you're removing a bishop without a penal cause, so generally you had to have some type of grave cause to remove him, in order, because of this general recognition that he has a right. So it's the Pope can remove them. Obviously, the Pope can move them from place to place, which the Pope does on a regular basis. But even that is ultimately, they usually ask for the consent of the bishop. I mean, technically, he can order the guy to move, but again, it has to do with that right. So it's very similar to, say, something in a family where the children, have rights to be treated in a certain way. It's true that the father has authority over them, and he can tell them what they have to do, and he can ignore certain rights that they might have. But in the end, it just ends up being more deleterious, and it's against justice. So it is something that he's going to have to, in the case of the father, he's going to have to answer before God for having violated the person's right without due cause. And so I think that's one of the real difficulties. As we discuss all these things, and this is one of the reasons, again, I wrote The Binding Force of Tradition and Magisterial Authority. And again, this book I just came out with on the limits of papal authority over the liturgy, it's all about the precision in these areas. In the last 50 to 60 years, actually even before that, we were seeing a collapse in theology where there was just a complete lack of precision about things such as, what are the limits of the Pope's authority? The Pope does have authority. That's what the first thing I established in this book. But there are limits that even the popes have said, and even councils have said, that limit his authority in relationship there. And it's all about the precision. And we're just seeing a general collapse in that precision. The upshot of that collapse means that because people don't know exactly where the lines of the authority are and aren't, even on the Pope's side, that when he has to recognize, it reminds me of the story of Pius XI. I've read the story. I've never actually been able to find the citation for it, but it actually says the insertion of St. Joseph into the canon was actually floated to Pius XI. And Pius XI said, I can't do that. I'm just the Pope, right? And so this gets to something which I call the quality of apostolicity, which I deal with this way. If something has always been something that the Pope's just considered it hands off, but it's to give precision to that, because it's this lack of precision that happens when someone gets into a position of authority. This is what we're seeing even in our own country. When the law is imprecise, or when it's not clear to the person, it might be in itself, such as the rights of the bishop in a particular see, or and that you have to observe that right unless there's penal cause. And here's what constitutes a penal cause, and this doesn't. And this is one of the reasons why you flesh that out in canon law. Again, the Pope is the author of canon law. He doesn't necessarily have to follow it, but he normally should, because the canon law is put in place precisely to safeguard the rights of those being governed. But that being said, that lack of precision then results that when someone who doesn't either adhere to that precision or doesn't know what that precision is, then he starts doing things that are outside his legitimate authority, or outside what he should or should not be doing based on the principles that govern prudence, or that govern justice, or just basic morality. And so I think this whole lack of precision is precisely the problem that we're having. That's why I wrote the books. But this is one of the reasons why the church has to, the theologians specifically, and lay people have to stop all this talking if they don't know the precise things in regard to all these matters.
Kind of reminds me of the book that you two guys correlated on tradition. If we want to know what tradition is, get the Franzelli book. One of you guys have the hardcover, and one of you guys have the softcover version.
Actually, no, he's got both of them now.
He's got both now. All right, never mind. CentriPress.com.
Yeah. Well, he owns the copyright, so but yeah, it is an important book. It could stand some revision. It was the very first translation I ever made. It's very heavily Thomistic and very heavily technical. And so I spent the entire time with the Lexicon of St. Thomas in my lap, just terrified I was going to miss some very important distinction or technical term. And so some of it comes out a little more literal than it needs to. And I've learned a little bit in about 10 years. And so I think it's something that's due for a revision when I can square away the time to smooth it out a little bit. But even in spite of that, the only people I've seen complain about it are people of a more modernist bent for the most. I don't want to commit the no true Scotsman fallacy, but for the most part, apart from people with legitimate criticisms of it, a lot of it, the people are complaining are that I didn't completely rewrite it or reinterpret what he says according to the Nouvelle Théologique or according to the modern prevailing ideas in theology. And that's usually the complaint that I get. Not, well, yeah, I mean, there are some sections that need to be fixed, or some typos and some footnotes or whatnot. But it's an interesting thing to me when I see that, and I see it's the people who follow the Nouvelle Théologique that are mad that I didn't follow kind of Casper's understanding of how to reinterpret the Roman school, basically in order to make it look like it's totally Hegelian. What we think now is what has always been true and better, and therefore everything needs to be made to reflect that. And that's Casper's approach, for example, to the Roman school, where they're talking about Franzlin or Kleutgen or what was Franzlin's disciple's name? I have his 4-volume Perrone. All right, people like that. It's not the beer; it's spelled with an E. But anyway. But actually, I can't
drink beer while you're reading the book.
No. Well, I got whiskey anyway. So, but actually, Father, here's a good question. I think, because I've seen this in some of the tests in regards to Strickland. Let's see what you think of this. Oh, goodness, if only I had it up, I could find it. But anyway, so the objection goes like this. Well, poor Bishop Strickland, this is all the trads' fault, because the trads and trad media pushing him further and further and to go further and be more outrageous. And they're giving him all this platform, and he wants this cause celebrate. And if only the trads weren't pushing everything, he wouldn't have, gone too far and gotten himself sacked. And I've seen that in a number of places now, where it's pivoting to, from, oh, you stupid trads, he's not going to sack Strickland. Now it's like, oh, it's all you trads' fault because you've been going after, pushing the envelope too much. And now these guys and Schneider and others are moving, and in that direction. And so what do you make of that objection? And generally the word traditional voices are on the internet right now, whether they're helping or hurting.
Ultimately, I have no certitude about what I'm about to say. So I just, obviously, people have to recognize this is purely my own opinion. I think they're taking offense at what the trads say because they want to. In other words, it's one of those things that they already have an agenda. They already have certain things. So what they're doing is just they're just waiting for us to say certain things. And then when we do say certain things, because people tend to be immoderate in their speech these days, and they tend not to be very prudent about what they say. I think what happens is they just use that as the opportunity. I think they would want to do this anyway. I think the removal of Strickland, in fact, I had heard through the grapevine that even though Traditionis Custodes was mentioned to him, the fact of the matter is that's not the principal reasons why he was removed. And so, and again, I don't know all the reasons that they gave because they haven't been made public. I don't know of any of them that are penal. I mean, I can't imagine penal. I know him personally. He's a man of upright moral character from everything I've seen. But that I think that they would have removed him anyway for the other statements that he were made that have nothing to do with the traditional Latin Mass, or it just has to do with the fact that they don't want to adhere to the tradition themselves. I mean, and that their agenda is to make this into a new church. I mean, Roche himself said it. This is a new church. I just want to know, okay, well, if this is a new church, is this the same as the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church? Because if it's not, then we have a problem. Or if it's a new church, what exactly do you mean? Did you mean a new religion? Or as Diane Montaigne, I don't know if you saw that, where she actually asked an archbishop afterwards who was talking at the synod. She asked him point blank, do we and this kind of became somewhat known. I mean, are we bound by the apostolic tradition? And he said, no, we're not. And so this is something which gives us an indicator that I think they're already on a path, And so anything that they can use along the way in order to try and bring about their changes, they're going to use. So I don't think it has to do with the trads. That doesn't mean that the trads aren't acting badly necessarily. And not all of them, of course, but it just means that they're going to use that as an excuse. You kind of saw it a little bit with Traditionis Custodes, when they were basically personifying, and people say, well, Father Ripperger's mentioned some of these things. Yeah. But the traditional movement has significantly changed since I gave that conference. And there are trads that do have that problem, but it doesn't speak to all trads. In fact, I don't even think it speaks to a majority of the traditionalists. I think it just basically that most traditionalists, especially the ones that have come in more recently, because as the phrase goes, the solution to pollution is dilution. The younger generation that's kind of coming into this thing doesn't have the axe to grind that I've seen that you saw maybe when the traditional movement was kind of in some of its initial stages. But even then, most of the people were just going because they wanted to attend the traditional Latin Mass. So anyway, that's a long, basic way of saying that I think they would have. It didn't matter whether the traditional stuff was there or not. They still would have removed him because of the fact that they want to promote certain things, which he is saying is against the perennial tradition of the church.
Yeah, especially when the synod was going on, and we could look at I was thinking when you were saying that about society comparison to that. I mean, you see almost the same thing going on. They're attacking anybody that speaks out morality, truthfulness, things like that, and executing. Well, not saying that Snyder executed, but like the Robert E. Lee statue a couple weeks ago, they basically personified that while videoing and melting it to the ground, trying to erase history to change and mold everything to a new society in a sense. I guess kind of like that idea was 40 years ago, some guy come out and said that the French Revolution didn't end. And if we say that Vatican II was a French Revolution in the church, in a sense, that hasn't ended yet either.
Okay, so Brian, you want to pipe in on that one? Oh, I think you have it muted.
I do. Sorry. Cats are all squirreling around here. But anyway, so it was the late Holy Father, Pope Benedict XVI, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, who had made the statement earlier on in his theological career that that Vatican II represents essentially a counter-syllabus, in that a reconciliation with the principles of 1789, i.e. the French Revolution, bringing the church in line with the French revolutionary social order. And I don't know to the extent that he revised that particular thought later on in life. And excuse me, he's gone on to meet his maker. So, and he can deal with it there. But beside that, there is, that is very much what we see when you look at the French Revolution. It is the very birth of communism. It is the French Revolution, and that's where it's born. And it just doesn't have the name yet, but all the elements of it is constituent operating principles. It's creating of conflict in order to push agenda, the constantly shifting what we now call Overton window of where we're conservative and liberal, but now the liberals become so radical, the old liberals become the new conservatives, and the old conservatives are now the far right, essentially. You have constant acts of violence and a refusal to enforce what little law is being in place when it's their side doing it. And so if, it was still against the penal law of the First Republic to kill a man in the street. But if you didn't sufficiently salute the revolution, walking down, over the Pont Neuf or something like that, the sans-culottes would take off their sabots or their wooden shoes and beat you to death. And then that got a name eventually, sabotage in French, which we imports right into English. That's the origin of that term. And you see that kind of violence is very much what we saw in the Summer of Love, L-U-V, love. It's very much the type of thing you saw in 1917 in Russia. It's the very type of thing you saw in Spartacus Week 1919 in Germany when the Bolsheviks tried to take over. It was all, again, this is all very French Revolution, 1848. There's all these same things, and so there is a sense in the church, and I think it's hit an apogee under the current Holy Father, where there is this sense of lawlessness, where you're looking at, it's not being particularly defined what the Bishop of Knoxville did. Or was it Knoxville, or which was that bishop a couple years ago? He was even on the world over. I'm not talking Stika. I might have said his diocese by accident, but there was a diocese where this one bishop just was making some personnel changes. A couple of people squawked. Some people knew, the squad among the USCCB, namely Supich, Gregory, and Tobin, and McElroy, right? And so they complain. Next thing you know, this bishop is sacked. No explanation is given. What did he do? Nothing. On the other hand, then you have, you get Ladaria put out for what is now called the DDF. I'm never going to get used to that, I don't think. But
I don't either.
Yeah, I know. Can we just go back to calling it the Holy Office of the Inquisition?
But yeah,
let's go back to calling it the Holy Office of the Inquisition.
I'm for that.
But he puts out a document: you cannot bless same-sex unions, and you get bishops in Europe that are very much along the more progressive viewpoint. Oh yeah, we're going to do it anyway. In Belgium, yeah, we're going to do it anyway. You got other bishops saying we're going to do it, and nothing happens. Literally, are saying you are defying what basically in an office of the Holy See, whose decisions require an obsequium religiosum, an assent of the intellect and will, right, a religious assent to a decision, and they say, nah, we're good. No cries of schism, no removal, just goes on, and that's happened before. You see how like Communion of the Hand came about, and so many of these other things as the liturgical changes got underway. And Paul VI said no, and the bishop said we're going to do it anyway. And then eventually a new document comes out. Well, yeah, we can allow it as an option or exception, and that's it. The lawlessness is always approved. The attempt to adhere to tradition, to adhere to, at this point, just a common sense of natural law, is criminalized, it seems like. And that's, again, those are the principles of 1789, irrespective of other questions in theology and whatnot.
All right, so we got to. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in the context with all of that, as you were mentioning, what obviously the pattern that follows from what Ryan just said is the good bishops are now trying to keep their head down because they know it could easily get lopped off. And what do we constitute a good bishop? Those who are at least are trying to adhere to the deposit of faith, which is one of the things that they complained about in relationship to Strickland. But that it's those who adhere to the deposit of faith, who are trying to promote holiness, to promote an authentic Catholic life. Those ones are reading the tea leaves, so to speak, and there's just realizing I got to keep my head down. And I think the difficulty too, though, is it also means that those who are not faithful to the church are emboldened in the process as well. I mean, I'm not suggesting the bishops, I'm not necessarily telling a specific bishop you need to kind of, start fighting this more openly. On the other hand, is the situation with Bishop Strickland is having a cooling effect because the other bishops that are solid are less likely to get up there and say anything. I'm not saying that that's justified before our Lord. I'm just saying that that's the effect that you're going to see.
On the lay level, since there's a probably majority of people are just, I don't want to say going nuts, but upset, angry, things of that nature. What is something they can do? You did a lecture with Burke at the Call of Holiness conference, and mentioned about holiness in there quite often. Is today's Saint Martin's feast day, the Saint Martin's Lent. If you want to do that, starts today. What are some things people can do just to settle down? Besides, obviously, buy your books, and so you can work with knowledge is power and calmness. What's some people can do to get through this situation?
Well, let me just make an observation. I think the first thing to do is educate themselves. This is one of the reasons why I commissioned Ryan to actually do that translation of the On Divine Tradition by Franzlin, is because of the fact that if you actually understand the tradition, and then also if you've read some of my stuff, or you don't necessarily have to read my stuff, you can just look at some of the citations and go read the other authors, because all I'm doing is taking the tradition and bringing it into the modern world so that people can actually see these are kind of the parameters. In the precision, if you know when the Holy Father or some bishop is acting outside his legitimate authority, then if you it doesn't bother you as much because you actually see it. It's when we don't know, or when when we're not certain about what he's doing, or that we think that he's misusing his authority or he's acting within his authority, that people start getting upset. And I think my basic attitude is, well, if you actually know the parameters of their authority, that is the ad personam, who they have authority over, and then the ad rem, the things over which they have authority, because no authority is absolute, not even the popes, except the only person who has absolute authority is God. So this is, once we recognize that, and then we have a precise knowledge of our faith, and we have a precise knowledge of exactly where those limits are, I think just educating ourselves will take a major edge off of it. So recently I mentioned in an interview that people also have to start becoming detached from the state of the church, because even though we love the church and we have to fight as much as we can for the good of the church and do everything we can for the good of the church, the fact of the matter is if we're attached to everything being perfect in the church, it's going to destroy us spiritually, and that's going to upset our spiritual peace. So I think just working on detachment. And here is one last thing that I think Ryan and I have even talked about. Ryan, he's the historian here, and he might know a little bit more than I. But I can't imagine your average peasant although maybe they did, because they probably were more educated than we let them give them credit for. But your average peasant in medieval Europe didn't know, probably in some cases, even the name of the Pope. And if they did know the name of the Pope, because they probably heard it in the canon, they may not even know what he was up to and what he was actually doing, and except insofar as maybe they might have heard stories or stuff here and there. But the fact that we know when the Pope is sneezing today is a huge problem, because what's happening is people are just hyper-focused on the guy rather than leading their Catholic life. Look, unless the Pope speaks infallibly, or unless he speaks in a matter that the theological note is such that you're bound to take a look at this thing and read it, the better thing to do is just ignore that. Everything's necessary to salvation has already been revealed. Just live your Catholic life and stop tuning into all that. I think that's one of the principal ways I think that people can kind of start calming down in all of this. You're still muted, Ryan.
Yeah. Oh. It's true enough in terms of, most people historically, their knowledge of who the Pope was would be quite out of date, and it just simply didn't pertain to them. They knew there was a Pope, but outside of that, who was he? What is he doing? Why do I need to know? It would never be anything that, even the average priest might not even be completely aware or at all concerned with what the Pope is doing, generally speaking. Unless something, your king went to war and started taxing the church, and the Pope got torqued off and put the whole church under interdict, and now you're not allowed to say mass. So now at least,
those were the days, weren't they?
Yeah,
couldn't they go back to that?
Boniface VIII, I'm thinking of here, Edward I. But and then Edward I says, well, yeah, the Pope put you under interdict, but my men are here. And are you going to say mass, or do I have to throw you into the dungeon there? So they said mass. Interdicts suddenly didn't mean anything anymore, right? But that's how that progressed. But beside that, even realistically, the cultists call it the earthly civil cultist to the Holy Father that you find, where his name is now on every Catholic lips. One, that's enabled by modern communication starting in the 18th century. But two, it's enabled by several historical factors. So one is Pius VII's resistance to Napoleon. And that was one where he became quite heroic. Modern historians don't quite know what to do with it, because it was all over the Holy See's temporal holding in central Italy, why he would not sign any, cooperate with Napoleon at the end. And Napoleon locked him up in a prison in Savona. And so, and he resisted. And then Napoleon said, well, fine. I didn't see how this is going to go. So he assembles all the French bishops and says, all right, you wanted your Gallican church? Well, here you go. Here you got your Gallican church. You don't need the Pope anymore. You're under me now. And they said, no, we're not going to do that. We already dealt with schism during the first phase of the revolution. We don't want to deal with it again. So they refused to cooperate with Napoleon, and Napoleon's trying to get out to Russia. So he's all right, fine, I'll deal with all this when I get back. Situation was quite changed when he got back. And so so Pius VII's resistance to Napoleon was heroic. It was respected so much that English, the Great Britain actually helps at the Treaty of Paris to restore the Pope's temporal sovereignty. Pius VII is converted into a bit of a folk hero on account of that. in nations that fought Napoleon. And so that, from there's like a cultus that begins with the papacy, and then modern communication allows that now what the Pope is doing very frequently. Once you get to the First Vatican Council, that's where you hit this sudden crescendo. And that's where the media presence at an ecumenical council, the first time there is such a thing as the media, and you have an ecumenical council, and that also provokes and complicates even the very question of infallibility. And you have all the debates between Guéranger and I'm looking at his picture in my head, but I can't say his name. The big opponent, Dullinger. Guéranger and Dullinger, fighting it out in the press over papal infallibility, when that was only like one small part of the schema that was supposed to be addressed. And they just essentially wanted to confirm what had always been done. So now you have this media apparatus talking about the Pope and everything the Pope's doing. You have the Pope's enemies, Pius IX, opponents of infallibility, writing these fictitious accounts of Pius IX rigging and gerrymandering all the bishops to come out with this definition that he absolutely wants, which is not at all what happened. And then you have, Pius IX's name. There's like a counter view that supports infallibility, and Guéranger is responsible for part of it, I would say, not by any intention to do anything mischievous, but because he's so quick to defend, everything that the Pope has done, and we always must support the Holy Father, which is true generally. We should, unless there's something obviously amiss. I mean, nobody's going to say you should support John the 12th, cuckolding all the nobility in Rome. Nobody's going to say we have to support all of Alexander the Sixth's initiatives to let the French brutalize Italy so he can get all the benefits of marrying his nephew Cesarion with the French. No, we don't want that. I mean, nobody would say you have to support these policies just because the Pope is doing it, right? But in the wake of the French Revolution, revolutionary times of 1848 and onwards, Guéranger is arguing very strongly for the hyper-papalism we kind of decry today. And nothing seemed amiss because you had Pius IX, he was a blessed. And then you get in Leo XIII. And so now once you get there, and you just have this sequence of popes who are generally very good. And even when they're not so good, like Pius XI, their teaching magisterium is very good, and nobody knows the other details of more untoward things of, let's say, Pius XI's character. Famously, when someone's Portuguese bishops urging him to do the consecration of Fatima, and he says, "Well, why is Our Lady going to shepherd children? If she wants this done, she'd come to me because I'm the Pope." That is his reaction to it, right? But they have Pius XII, and so there's just this general, nothing's really amiss. So that view that everything the Pope does, right down to the papal BM, is a good thing because it was papal, therefore is good, and that's kind of that progression of how we get there. And then that same view is again pushed and enforced following Vatican II. And so that you've got, and it really, for our modern generation, that crystallizes with John Paul II, because he had such a charismatic personality. And so you only have to, it's that you just get to a certain point where you stop and you're like, well, wait a minute though. He's a great God, Pope, but why is he doing this? This doesn't seem right. Oh, shut up, traditionalist. Go away, traditionalist. You're detracting from how we should all be supporting every single thing the Holy Father does. And I think that's the problem, is that it is the course of a historical epic, this particular view, that you have to support and promote everything. And it comes out of a very specific historical context.
Yeah, I think that's true. Actually, this is something that I've kind of noticed in reading that same history. It was almost, when I saw that, from the time of the definition. In fact, as you know, Ryan, that was one of the real concerns about some of the people at the First Vatican Council. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad they actually defined papal infallibility, but the concern was that if you define papal infallibility, even with the conditions, what's going to happen is everybody's going to think everything he does is infallible. And that was one of their concerns in relationship to that. it also, and after that, as you began to see, there was I think that's kind of the attitude that was going on in the 40s and 50s was, we can make all these changes, we can do all these things because we don't have to worry, because it's never going to fail, it's never going to be bad, right? Because the Pope is infallible, etc. It reminds me of the that whole time frame, where there kind of became this attitude that the Pope can do no wrong, and that there's this that everything he does is perfect. It basically, I always made it likened it to when Peter said to Christ, even if the others betray you, I won't. And then he turns to him and says, you're going to deny me 3 times, right? So there's this an attitude that we never have to worry about the Pope doing anything wrong. And that's, first of all, it just wasn't historically the case. But the other part of it was, it was just a lack of precision that got into people's thinking as a result of all this.
One more thing I think we should mention too is, there we go. So this is from Vatican I. And this is something that's also really concerning about today's event. So this is First Vatican Council from the 4th session. Hence, too, that meaning of the sacred dogmas is ever to be maintained, which has once been declared by Holy Mother Church, and there must never be any abandonment of this sense under the pretext or in the name of a more profound understanding. Quasi dictere, you can't say, oh, well, this teaching, we've come to a new understanding about the human person, therefore this teaching isn't important anymore, or it can be discarded, because that's not how dogma and doctrine work. Rather, it's the sense in which the church understood these terms, this formulation. At the time it was declared, this is something that's historically discoverable, because you can look at the documents and the sessions in which that doctrine was put out. So it was formally promulgated and decreed. So, and of course we have the current Holy Father, unfortunately, just put out a document where he said the exact opposite of this from Vatican I.
One of the other things that I've started to tell people in this whole context in relationship to, the Pope actually saying things that are, head scratchers, to say the least, is the fact that, the church always knew that the Pope wasn't perfect, and that he was only infallible under certain circumstances, and that outside that context, we had to follow a set of certain principles to determine how much assent we would give to those things, etc. Is the very fact that, and it's still actually in the 1962 Missal. However, at a certain point, it used to be, so if you go back to the 1944 Missal, before Bugnini got his paws onto the thing, during Lent, there was a commemoration that you said every single day for the Pope during Lent. And so there was a recognition that we have to pray for him if we expect him to do the right thing. Then we stopped praying for him at the Mass, which is the most efficacious form of prayer. We stopped praying for the guy. And then people just aren't generally praying for the guy. And then we wonder why he's doing the things that he's doing. In the meantime, as I mentioned, then we've got this whole problem of we get the leaders we deserve. But I think part of this is we're just not praying enough, doing prayers, sufferings, and good works for this guy enough, so that we don't have, so that grace will start to have an effect in the guy's life. But we have to really go back. This is why when the first year I was ordained, someone asked me, are you committed to the 1962? And I said, no, of course not. And the guy looks at me, I said, I'm committed to the 44 before Bugnini got his paws on this thing, right? Because literally every single change the guy made, every one that I've seen and looked and come to knowledge of was wrong, even in our rite, let alone the new rite. But anyway, that all being said, we need to go back to, if I were the Pope, one of the first things I'd do is impose, you have to start saying these commemorations again in Lent. But there we are.
Well, at least you didn't say, I hope you start tweeting harder or tweeting more instead of praying more.
Yeah.
Ryan, what you got on the docket list coming out of the press?
Actually, I already got some things queued up if you want me to share my screen.
Go for it.
Let me see. So I'm going to start out with this one. Oh, there we go. So St. John Fisher, it's the only biography of St. John Fisher in print that I know of. There's some other good books about him, but the only full biography going over his life. It's drawn strictly, so it's written by a Catholic with a strong sense of Catholic faith, but at the same time is makes use of the manuscripts, the state papers, letters, documentation. So it's a proper historical biography. And it's really, really good. And I'm thinking in context of Bishop Strickland, and from all accounts, everything I could see, Strickland was a great bishop. He's not a John Fisher, but almost nobody is. So that's not a bad bar. But when looking at it, I think this is a book that, priests and bishops should also read. So, for example, St. Charles Borromeo, when he became the Archbishop in Milan, when he was able to take residence in the city, he had read in the available life of John Fisher, which had been published in Latin in England and sent abroad, and he read that, and he knew he had to become a bishop like John Fisher. St. Robert Bellarmine, when he became a bishop in Capua, he had before him the lives of holy bishops and the life of St. John Fisher, his biographer Fuligati tells us. Because
Ryan, don't you actually have a book on good bishops?
That was something we were talking about years ago, trying to produce something like that.
Because I think a book like that would be great.
Yeah. No, it would actually. That would be. Yeah, I was looking for something like that. I just got to put it all together. The lives of good and saintly bishops, but so anyway, but in light of how much love Strickland was, and it's good to have an example of good bishops, especially as we complain about bishops so much, in the church. Then this was mentioned earlier in the program, St. Robert Bellarmine's treatise on the papacy. It's about 700 pages or so. It's a lot of great theological material, and again, I highly recommend that book, and reading all of it and not just getting stuck on one particular question.
Good bedside table.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Or just want to leave somewhere and look, hey, look how sharp I am. I got this. Let's see. I just came out with this fairly recently in the workshop of St. Joseph. And so just getting toward, there's so much being written on the current problems in the church. My press, Mediatrix Press, I do not publish anything on the current problems in the church. I do not publish the latest Vatican II, Be Afraid, Be Angry, or the latest sexiest book on Fatima and whatever secret we're up to now. And I'm not trying to disparage Fatima, by the way, just to be clear, but rather the way people get obsessed with following these little historical questions, but not the actual message of Fatima. Pray the Rosary, go to for 5 First Saturdays. So
I don't know what you're talking about. There's peace right now. We're living in the peace.
Yeah.
You a Fatima fundamentalist or something?
Yeah, it must be. So this is a book. It's a really nice. It's a work of historical fiction by a priest, Father Heuser, in the early 20th century. Great little book, and it's a fictional account of some Egyptian Jews at the time the Holy Family arrives in Egypt, and their encounters with them, and it does a lot of work giving you some of the history of the Davidic priesthood, the Messiah, how it was understood in those times, descriptions of how various temple ceremonies would go on as these people are watching Joseph as being of the line of David, being one of the carpenters chosen to help prepare the temple, and all of it works in terms of how the history of that time actually was. And so it's which is rare, especially for biblical historical fiction. A lot of that's pretty hokey. This is a really good good text, and focus a lot on Our Lady as well. And lastly, Ascent to the Mind of God by the Ladder of Creation by St. Robert Bellarmine. And I did a new translation of this. This one is a really good book, just for he takes creation itself and uses that and said, let's look at the various points of creation. He names 15 steps that will lead you to God himself, and through various meditations. It's a really wonderful little book. I have the original Latin and a little pocket edition that I can take to adoration with me. But this is just a really fantastic book to get for all of those things. And if you're really devoted to St. Therese in the Little Way, this is a book accommodated that spirit of taking all the things around you and, in incorporating how we can turn everything around us back to God. So, and I've got many, many more, oh, wait a minute. I didn't click I'm sorry. I'm talking about these other books, but I don't have the picture up. But anyway, that's the Workshop of St. Joseph. That's the Ascent to the Mind of God. So these are all great works, which I do recommend. And if you need, more, mediatrixpress.com. I've got upwards of about 80 or more books in print, and I've got more that'll be rolling off. I've got an excellent work of St. John Fisher where he shreds Luther. He utterly shreds Luther in his Luther's teaching in his work Babylonian Captivity. So that should be out. I'm hoping by December. I'm just waiting to get it back from my editor so I can get it laid out and to the printers and hopefully on one of your tables.
Father, go ahead and pitch your press.
Well, you can just go to Centrad Press. I mean, I've talked about some of the books that we aren't tonight. The other book that I would really like to re-stress again is the one that Ryan translated, which is on divine tradition, because it's the one that will start giving people a foundation in the tradition so that they can rest, so that when they see a lot of this stuff going on in the church, it doesn't bother them as much. There's a variety of different things on there. There's some stuff on spiritual warfare, and so they can just take a look. I am in the process of writing a book called Shop Talk. It's about philosophical lessons I learned working for my father as a mechanic, but it's it's the type of book that you would look at it and say, okay, this is what happened. This is the lesson to be learned from it, in the shop. But then the other thing I'm in the process of doing is I've taken, which I've talked to Steve about, I've taken all of my conferences and all of the sermons that I've done through AI. AI voice recognition, which is actually has like a 98 to 99% accuracy. It even recognizes my voice when I speak in different languages. We've transcribed all of my conferences. Those will be being compiled and laid out and put in. They need editing, but they'll be put out in books as we go forward in the future. So one will be on spiritual warfare, one will be on Our Lady, one will be on doctrinal matters, another one on virtues, things like that. So those are some of the things that are coming forward in the future.
Gentlemen, thanks for your time today. I'm sure everyone in the chat room is
One more quick question though. On that Divine Tradition book. I thought I changed the cover. The old cover up there.
Yeah, you know what? I'd have to actually look. I think. I don't know. I'd actually have to
reverted to the first cover.
I don't think so. I mean, I think because you sent me the files and I just have them set up. The the funny thing of it is that even though I read your translation because I was going through it with you as you were doing it, it's kind of funny. I just remember when I remember reading Franzlein on tradition, it was one of those things that first of all, every time I would see his name mentioned, it would be by people like Congar or Skillebex or these guys. Everyone had to admit that they actually looked at him, because if you didn't, you weren't considered a real scholar. But they all kept talking about this guy. So I'm like, I got to get this guy. So when I first read it in Latin, I'm like, this is it. This is what people need to know. This is this is the structure of tradition. This is how it works. These are the different kinds of tradition. And then shortly after that, after I read it, that's when I talked to you about translating it. So hopefully people will start reading. It's not an easy read, but this is one of the things that people have to learn. You're not going to get intellectual precision by sitting down and reading, pious books all the time. You have to start putting the time in to learning the faith and learning it well.
Very good. Father, before we go, can you give everyone a final blessing?
Sure. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus super vos sit manet semper. Amen.
Appreciate it, guys. Thanks a lot. And maybe next time we'll do one with under better circumstances.
Let's hope so.